All right, so we are studying Eli tonight from the Old Testament. Eli. We finished up Gamaliel and Nicodemus and Joseph of Arimathea last Wednesday night, and so as has been our pattern going Old Testament, New Testament, back to Old Testament, and so we're going to look at Eli tonight. That's really mainly the first 4 chapters of 1 Samuel. Is going to be the main focus of our actual study in the text this evening. We know from 1 Samuel chapter 1 and verse 9, in addition to several other places that describe him as a priest of God. He's in Shiloh. The reason he's in Shiloh is because that's where it's kind of the semi-permanent place of the tabernacle of God and the Ark of the Covenant. Obviously before the temple was built, at least in the latter times of the judges. And so Shiloh was kind of the Jerusalem during the time of the judges, the place where people would go and to offer the sacrifices and so forth. We see both in Judges 18 and in verse 31, as well as Psalm 78 and in verse 60, both of these places reference Shiloh and as being the place of the tabernacle for quite some time, as well as the Ark of the Covenant. He was a judge over Israel for 40 years. Sometimes we forget that he was one of the judges. Eli, because of his connection to Samuel, a lot of times we just think of Eli kind of as a priest who kind of helped raise Samuel, but he was also one of the judges. We find for 40 years he judged Israel. He died at age 98 in chapter 4 and in verse 15. Even in today's age, that's up there. And I mean, people count themselves blessed to live anywhere over 85 and 90 years old. That's getting on up there even by our standards. And so at age 98 at that time was really something. But he died at age 98. And of course, we'll talk about how he died and what happened. Physically, obviously, age takes its toll on everybody. And we're given several references to the fact that at this point in his life, Eli had lost his sight. His eyes had become dim. We find that in verse 15 of chapter 4 as well. Earlier in chapter 3, there's a reference to it as well. And we know that he was, quote-unquote, heavy, verse 18. Think of a larger fella. Even at 98 years old, he was apparently a larger fella. And then after Eli and his sons, so Eli and his sons were of the lineage of Ithamar. Remember, there were only 2 sons of Aaron after Nadab and Abihu were punished by God for their sin of adding to the commandment of the Lord. There were 4 sons total. Nadab and Abihu were destroyed for their sins, and then that left Ithamar and Eleazar. Ithamar, Eli and his sons were of the line of Ithamar, and the high priesthood, because it had been taken away from the lineage of Eleazar for a period of time, it ended with Eli and his sons of the lineage of Ithamar, and the high priesthood then went back to Eleazar. And that was actually prophesied by the man of God in 1 Samuel chapter 2 and in verse 35. He actually references that fact. That a real priest, a real individual who is right in my sight is going to take over as the high priest. According to anything through that right now, these are kind of just the facts about Eli. Anything through that before we get into his character and so forth. Okay, a little bit of outside history. The Talmud, we reference the Talmud a lot. That's the Jewish rabbinic history. That's the recorded histories of the rabbis on through the ages. Some of it's very accurate. Some of it, you kind of understand there's some bias there with regard to Judaism and the Jewish faith and so forth. But the Talmud lists Eli as a prophet. But I mentioned that this is unlikely, given that we're told that the word of the Lord was rare in those days. There was no widespread revelation, according to 1 Samuel 3, verse 1. Now, granted, what we're going to find in chapter 2, at the end of chapter 2, there is a man of God who comes to Eli and prophesies to him or speaks the word of God to him. But it's interesting that a man of God had to come and speak to Eli. It didn't come directly from God to Eli. And so while Eli, it's possible he was a prophet, but there's nothing in the scriptures that suggests that. In fact, the scriptures even suggest that was not a very common occurrence to have prophecy revealed and that sort of thing at that point in time. According to Josephus, Phinehas, which is one of Eli's two sons, Phinehas, however you want to pronounce it, officiated as high priest because Eli had resigned due to his advanced age. So once he got up to a certain point, he couldn't see very well. According to Josephus, again, okay, take that with a grain of salt. This isn't actually written in the Bible, but supposedly Eli, who had been serving as high priest, resigned from that position. Even though he was still a priest, he resigned from the service of high priest, and Phinehas may have been a high priest at that point. But certainly one of them, either Phinehas or Eli, Phinehas I think was the elder son, so it would have been him if it wasn't Eli, was serving as high priest. Anything through that? All right, so let's look into his character. So going to chapter 1, and we're not going to read all of the chapters of chapters 1 through 4, the whole thing, but we are going to pick on certain elements that we find here to kind of note some details about Eli's character. So first thing with chapter 1, this is mainly when we're introduced to Hannah. That's kind of the focus of the first half of chapter 1. It's all about Hannah. And really, even going into chapter 2, that kind of first 10 verses or so of chapter 2 is about Hannah as well. So we have the situation with Hannah, and we're not going to go through all that because we're not studying Hannah, but we did have a sermon not too long ago about Hannah and the fact that she prayed for a son. And so in verse 9, she arose, she goes to the tabernacle. We see in verse 9 that Eli the priest was sitting on the seat by the doorpost of the tabernacle of the Lord. And she was in bitterness of soul and prayed to the Lord and wept in anguish. Verse 11, then she made a vow and said, O Lord of hosts, if you will indeed look on the affliction of your maidservant and remember me and not forget your maidservant, but will give your maidservant a male child, I will give him to the Lord all the days of his life, and no razor shall come upon his head. So it happened, verse 12, as she continued praying before the Lord, that Eli watched her mouth. Now Hannah spoke in her heart, only her lips moved, but her voice was not heard. Therefore Eli thought she was drunk. So you have a situation here in verse 13, 12, and 13, as Eli's watching her, that he just assumes that she's just kind of, she's out of it. Okay, it doesn't take into, account the possibility that she was praying. Keep in mind, though, she's very emotional. Okay, it sounds like she's kind of in the process of weeping. She's distraught during this. And so there's probably going to be a lot of emotion being showed as she's kind of mouthing the words. And some of us are like that too when we pray. I know some of us may pray and our lips don't move at all. But then some of us, in order for us to form the words in our head, we kind of have to mouth them. And so maybe when we're going to bed at night, sometimes we actually mouth the words. And it helps us, especially in the midst of a kind of a emotionally charged moment, it helps to be able to focus those words that she's praying. But Eli, he just kind of assumes that she's drunk. And so Eli says in verse 14, how long will you be drunk? Put your wine away from you. Then in verse 15, Hannah says, no, my Lord, I'm a woman of sorrowful spirit. I have drunk neither wine nor intoxicating drink, but have poured out my soul before the Lord. And then in verse 17, Eli answered and said, go in peace, and the God of Israel grant your petition which you have asked of him. And so we find in verse 19 that that's exactly what happens. But between verse 12 and verse 17, you've got kind of a very different attitude or different mindset from Eli. At first he thinks she's drunk. He kind of gets on to her about being drunk. She says, no, I'm not. Here's the situation. And so Eli says, well, go in peace. I think he, at this point, he is then putting things together, and he's saying, I realize that you're distraught. You're in a great sorrow. May God grant whatever it is you asked. And there's nothing here in verse 16 or 17 or 18 that suggests that she revealed to him what that request was. Now, whether or not what Eli said was therefore binding because he was high priest, perhaps at this point, nothing is said about that other than the fact that certainly she took that to mean that perhaps God will do, because Eli has said, may God grant your request. So it's kind of, you see the change in her through the rest of this chapter in her, it says in verse 18, the fact that she went away, she ate, and her face was no longer sad. She worshiped before the Lord, and so forth. So we see the fact that in chapter 1, upon hearing Hannah's sorrow, he blesses her. Then we go to chapter 2. Samuel has been born. She has weaned Samuel. And at that point of having been weaned, then she takes him and presents him to Eli. These first, 6 or 7, 8, 10, 11, how many verses? 11 verses. First 11 verses really are all about Hannah. And then starting in verse 12, we're introduced to the situation with Eli's sons, which we'll come back to in just a minute. So starting in verse 18, we see at the end of chapter 1, Samuel is presented to Eli. And then in verse 18, Samuel ministered before the Lord even as a child, wearing a linen ephod. We see how that his mother, how Hannah brings him a little robe every year. Remember, he had just been weaned. Okay, that's how young. He wasn't like 12 years old. He'd just been weaned. So, I mean, I don't even know how old, maybe 2 years old, maybe. I mean, in some cultures, they wean them a little bit longer than other cultures, but, I mean, it couldn't have been more than a couple of years old that he is at this point. And so in verse 20, Eli would bless Elkanah and his wife and say, the Lord give you descendants from this woman for the loan that was given to the Lord, and they would go to her own home. We see in verse 20, verse 21, how that Hannah is blessed with more children. We see 3 sons and 2 daughters. And then starting in verse 22, and really from chapter 22 on through chapter 4, or from verse 22 on through chapter 4, it's all about Eli, his sons, and Samuel. It's really where the focus is. Now, Eli was very old. He heard everything his sons did to all Israel and how they lay with the women who assembled at the door of the tabernacle of meeting. So flipping back over real quick, we see the fact that he trained Samuel from a young age in the tabernacle of the Lord. Obviously, a lot of that, how Samuel ended up and how he was quite wise and quite faithful to the Lord. Whether some of that was thanks to Eli's training. Obviously, his mother and father were very faithful people as well. Especially, we see more about Hannah than we do Elkanah. Certainly, Samuel on his own was very faithful as well. But going to the fact that what we see from Eli with regard to his sons, his 2 sons, we know that his 2 sons were not faithful. They were not they were not serving God as they were supposed to. Eli was very old. He heard everything his sons did to all of Israel, how they lay with the women who assembled at the door of the tabernacle of meeting. And so in verse 23, he said to them, why do you do such things? For I hear of your evil dealings from all the people. No, my sons, for it is not a good report that I hear. You make the Lord's people transgress. If one man sins against another, God will judge him. But if a man sins against the Lord, who will intercede for him? Nevertheless, they did not heed the voice of their father, because the Lord desired to kill them. All right, so let's focus on the end of verse 25 for a minute. So we see how Eli, he kind of reprimands his sons over the things that they're doing, and we'll look earlier here in just a minute at what else they were involved in as well. But when he ends this, he says, if a man sins against the Lord, who will intercede for him? It's not like you've sinned against another person, and so, you've got, obviously, sacrifice, but you've sinned against the Lord in your service to him, in the tabernacle. Who's going to intercede for you when you're supposed to be interceding on behalf of the people? Nevertheless, they did not heed the voice of their father, because the Lord desired to kill them. So is this saying that God forced them not to listen so that God could destroy them? It's kind of reminiscent of Pharaoh, right? How that God hardened Pharaoh's heart so that he would not listen. I mean, does God infringe upon the free will of people to do what they want to do? Does God force people to do what he wants or not do what he wants?
It's like her heart was open by God.
Okay.
It's the same thing. God made
Okay.
And their decision was theirs to make. They just chose, like Pharaoh's heart was hard. He chose to say no. Lydia's heart was softened. She chose to say yes.
Okay.
It's not that God made them choose. Let me rephrase that. He made them choose. He didn't make them decide what to choose.
Okay. Kind of like with Pharaoh, God had allowed Pharaoh to become king over all of these people, allowed Pharaoh to be worshipped as if he were a god, as they did to the pharaohs. And so Pharaoh was kind of high and mighty and full of himself. God allowed him to have that position. But God also knew that that pride ultimately would be his downfall. And so when it says that God hardened his heart, he did so in the fact that God allowed him all of this glory and all of this power, knowing full well that he's not going to listen. And the same would be true here with the sons of Eli, in that they're going to do what they want. Okay, they didn't heed the voice of their father, not because God didn't let them, but because he had allowed them at that point. I mean, he could have destroyed them at any time. He could have done, just as he had done with Nadab and Abihu, he could have done to these two. But he didn't. He waited. And they continued to choose their course. And then ultimately their downfall, as well as their father's downfall, ended up being a part of the process that included Samuel as well. All right, so thoughts or comments with that one? Because that was it kind of just stands out to you, doesn't it? All right, so we see that he reprimands his sons for what they're doing, that they're laying with women who are assembling at the door of the tabernacle of meeting. A lot of the commentary suggested that these were servant women who were there to serve in the tabernacle, whereas some were suggesting these were just people coming to offer sacrifices, and part of the means by which they were allowed to do that was to lay with these two. Whichever way it wasn't good, obviously. It certainly wasn't what they were supposed to be doing. And so we see in verse 12, there's another thing that his sons were involved in. The sons of Eli were corrupt. They did not know the Lord. And the priest's custom with the people was that when any man offered a sacrifice, the priest's servant would come with a 3-pronged flesh hook in his hand while the meat was boiling. Then he would thrust it into the pan or kettle or cauldron or pot, and the priest would take for himself all that the flesh hook brought up. So they did in Shiloh to all the Israelites who came there. Also, before they burned the fat, the priest's servant would come and say to the man who sacrificed, "Give meat for roasting to the priest, for he will not take boiled meat from you, but raw." So, of course, one of the ways the priests were taken care of was through the sacrifices. God made allowance for that. And one of the customs that these priests had done in the past with Shiloh was they would bring whatever it was that was being sacrificed, they'd put it in a pot, they'd boil it, and then whatever would come up after being boiled for a while, that was given to the priest. Okay, that's what he could have. But these two, what they decided was they didn't want boiled meat. They wanted the prime meat. They wanted the best of it. And so give meat for roasting to the priest. Not the boiled stuff, not the fat and everything else. They want the good stuff. And if the man said to him, "They should really burn the fat first, then you may take as much as your heart desires," he would answer him, "No, you must give it now. And if not, I will take it by force." This is how they were acting. Okay, whether they were personally saying that or their servant that they're sending out to collect the sacrifice is saying this, regardless, this is coming from these two, the sons of Eli. "Therefore the sin of the young men was very great before the Lord, for men abhorred the offering of the Lord." It's the fact that every time that they would make an offering to the Lord, they knew these two priests were going to be there and they were going to take the best of it. And so it's like, what's the point? I'm supposed to be offering the best to the Lord, But here come the priests, and contrary to what they're supposed to do, they're taking the best of it. And so it brought reproach upon the tabernacle, certainly, but then the men abhorred making offerings to the Lord because of it. So yeah, these two weren't exactly great examples, especially for Samuel. But at no point do we see any negative influence being made on Samuel by these two. So I think that's worth observing as well. Thoughts or comments through that? Yes, sir.
And if you're the one bringing the offering, perhaps it would weigh on your conscience. Did I do enough?
Yeah. Yeah, because
what I thought was being given, only a part, a percentage, whatever.
right, and the best of it got taken by the priest, and so it didn't go to God. Yeah.
Did that cover my sins or my whatever the offering was there?
Yeah, that's a good point.
Also, yes, these two are going to end up heavy as their dad.
According to what the man of God here is going to say in just a moment, it sounds that way. Yeah, it sounds that way. Any other thoughts or comments? Yes, sir.
Evil companions can corrupt the morals, but they don't have to.
Right.
We see that in Samuel.
Yes, that's a great point. Remember, Samuel, just toddler height maybe, is being kind of reared at the tabernacle. And so you would think, as would be part of our social structure, Samuel would be looking up to these two, kind of seeing Eli almost as a father figure, these two as like big brothers. If it was the case, it certainly didn't have any impact, negative influence on Samuel, regardless. And of course, Samuel, again, he had his father and his mother who were both faithful people as well. And I'm sure Samuel got to see them at least once a year during the course of his life as well. But I think that's a great point. Evil communication certainly can corrupt good morals, and Paul condemned the Corinthians for that in 1 Corinthians 15. But it doesn't have to if you don't let it. And certainly Samuel didn't let it.
Yeah. How old do you think as a kid, they wouldn't maybe have understood what was happening anyway.
Yeah.
I'm not saying that.
That's possible.
I don't know how old he was.
Right. Yeah, and we're not told how old he
My
was.
kids were that toddlers, they would have no idea somebody was cheating the
Right.
offering.
That's true. Yeah, that's true. He just may not have understood what was happening at that moment, at that time.
Eli sheltered them, who knows?
Yeah. Now in chapter 3, of course, he's of an age to understand at that point. But at this point, when he's being raised and so forth, yeah, it's possible he just had no idea what was going on.
Do we know the age of his two sons, Eli's two sons? If Eli's 98,
Yeah.
they could be.
They're probably up there too. 60s, 70s-ish maybe, unless he had them later in life.
And Samuel being a young child.
Yeah, it could be that was too far of a distance between the two. It's possible. It's possible. Yeah. Yeah. All right. So then we have the fact that his sons are rebuked for the evil that they did. They're taking the prime cuts of meat from the sacrifices of the people. They're committing adultery with women assembled at the door of the tabernacle. But according to chapter 3 and in verse 13, he did not restrain his sons from committing evil. And I know we're jumping ahead a little bit here, but in chapter 3 and in verse 11, this is the Lord speaking to Samuel. The Lord said to Samuel, "Behold, I will do something in Israel at which both ears of everyone who hears it will tingle. In that day I will perform against Eli all that I have spoken concerning his house from beginning to end. For I have told him that I will judge his house forever for the iniquity which he knows, because his sons made themselves vile, and he did not restrain them. And therefore I have sworn to the house of Eli that the iniquity of Eli's house shall not be atoned for by sacrifice or offering forever." Now, notice that God's punishment, God's anger, his justice is not just aroused against Eli's two sons, but also against Eli. And we're not told necessarily that Eli was doing the same things that his sons were. At the very least, he condemns them for sleeping with the women at the door of the tabernacle. However, in addition to not restraining these young men, we do find, no, that's not what I want to do. Back in chapter 2, there's a man of God who comes to Eli. And this man of God, in verse 22, Eli was very old. He heard everything his sons did to all Israel. That's about right. Verse 27. Then a man of God came to Eli and said to him, "Thus says the Lord, did I not clearly reveal myself to the house of your father when they were in Egypt in Pharaoh's house? Did I not choose him out of all of the tribes of Israel to be my priest, to offer upon my altar, to burn incense, and to wear an ephod before me?" Who is he talking about? Aaron. Yeah, Aaron. "Did I not give to the house of your father all the offerings of the children of Israel made by fire? Why do you kick at my sacrifice and my offering, which I have commanded in my dwelling place, and honor your sons more than me, to make yourselves fat with the best of all the offerings of Israel, my people?" So while Eli may not have been involved in the sins of adultery with these ladies at the door of the tabernacle, what was he involved in? Well, first of all, he's allowing this stuff to happen. Apparently, he is partaking. Now, whether or not he was fully aware of, you would think he would be, right? I mean, raw meat and then, grilling it and eating it versus boiled meat, you'd think you'd know the difference. And I think that's what's being revealed here, is what God is saying: you kick at my sacrifice. What my people are bringing to me, you and your sons are taking. And he specifically says, God does through this man, you honor your sons more than me because you're eating of the best of the offerings of the sacrifices of Israel. And so it would seem as though it wasn't just that Eli was aware of it, but just kind of ignored it. He was kind of duplicitous in it. He was guilty by actually enjoying. It wasn't just his two sons who were eating this meat. He was as well. And it would seem that he was fully aware of where this meat was coming from. Maybe he just didn't ask too many questions. Maybe he didn't really say much about it. But when all of a sudden when they went from boiled meat to nice steaks on the grill, you would think he knows the difference. And certainly God, it would seem, he's saying that, Eli, you know full well what was happening. And yet you chose to honor your sons more than you honor me. So those two things. Anything else about Eli's character in terms of sinful nature, things like that? We don't have a whole lot more about Eli. But those two things, the fact that he did not restrain his sons, particularly with the sins with these women, and the fact that he is also involved in the extortion of people bringing meat to offer to the Lord, he is by extension extorting the children of Israel as well. Even though his sons are doing it, he's partaking, and they're making themselves fat with the best of all the offerings. Thoughts or comments through that? Yes, Nolan?
Just reminded of Jesus' statements about he that loveth father, mother, brother, sister, son or daughter more than me, those kind of things. And in the bigger picture, God gives us blessings in numerous forms or ways. Now, individually, he may give me $1,000 and I have trouble letting go of some of that monetary. Here it's children, family relationship, which are blessings and super great things. But if that comes between you and the Lord, it seems that's what Eli has trouble.
It would seem. It would seem.
Relate to that, not excuse it.
Right.
Not make it right.
Right. And this is one of those things, especially in Western culture. It's not necessarily as big a deal in the Eastern culture. But in Western culture, as soon as you start questioning a person's parental ability or suggesting that they're a bad parent or that they are maybe just their shortcomings as a parent, it's just like people go crazy. Okay, in Eastern culture, it's not really that big of a deal, but in Western culture, it is. And so you hear a lot of things like, who were bad parents, for instance. And about Eli is on that list a lot of times. And certainly there's nothing we can go to say, well, here's where Eli maybe didn't do what he should have done, or maybe he should have done more of this, or whatever. It does sound like maybe he wasn't much of a disciplinarian. Okay, he was all bark and no bite, so to speak. He reprimanded them. We see that back earlier in chapter 2. Okay, he will reprimand them, but they continue doing what they wanted to do, which suggests what? What commandment are they breaking by virtue of ignoring their father? Yeah, honor your father and your mother. Okay, and certainly it doesn't sound as though that honoring their father was something they were used to doing, because they just ignored and continued doing it. And did he do anything about it when they ignored him? No. No, he didn't do anything about it. And it's certainly, you could gain that type of application that as a parent, we can say threaten, but we can, threaten to punish, threaten to ground someone, whatever, all we want to. But unless we actually have the bite to go with the bark, a lot of times kids will learn that, they talk a lot, but they're not really going to do anything. And it just kind of makes you wonder if Eli's sons had been properly disciplined growing up, perhaps it wouldn't have gotten that bad. But even at an elderly age, they were, and I'm not saying he was 98 at the point of chapter 2. I don't think maybe he was quite that old yet. Not until chapter 4 do we know that he's that old. But even on up in age, it was still Eli's responsibility. Okay, he was, at least up to a certain point, he was the high priest, but these were his sons. And if they weren't doing right, he should have put a stop to it, and he didn't do it. And certainly there is a lesson there for us as parents to make sure that when we're raising our kids, that we teach them not just right from wrong, but that there are consequences to our actions. And his 2 sons are maybe examples of people who didn't have very many consequences. Perhaps. Again, that's speculation. We don't have any example that specifically, other than chapter 2, he did strongly worded reprimand them, but he just didn't do anything about it. Thoughts or comments through that? Yes, sir.
I know, look at this, we're kind of jumping around, which is fine. There's a little bit of insight back in chapter 2 into verse 12. They were corrupt, but they knew not the Lord.
Yeah.
We read that part about the Lord wanted to slay them. To me, I just kind of take that's in keeping with God's righteous judgment, or
right,
justice, as we've talked about.
Right.
As he would do anybody, he would slay them because of the evil they've done.
Yeah.
But as Doug was bringing out, it had been their choice not to know the Lord.
Right.
That's how they lived, even when their dad's in their face saying, "You need to stop."
Right.
You got to stop.
Yeah, and look, to be clear, obviously they knew Jehovah in the sense that they knew the law. I'm sure they'd been taught the law and things. But in terms of knowing the character of righteousness, the character of service and so forth, they did not have the character that they needed to have to be proper, not just proper priests to the Lord, but a proper child of God to start with, a proper Israelite to start with. And so, again, it was their choices. Maybe Eli did everything he could when they were growing up. And then at certain points, they just kind of decided to do their own thing. And Eli was really at a loss to be able to change any of it. But we still have the fact that God specifically says, what did he not do? He didn't restrain them. And perhaps that's even more of a glaring problem because they're in the public eye. And of course, with Nadab and Abihu, all those who come near me, what must they do? They must regard me as holy. And I must be glorified among all the people. And his sons weren't doing that. And so, especially as priests, Not to say that it's any less important for anyone else, but especially as priests who are supposed to be the interceders for the children of Israel here, it was especially important for them to be pure in their ways, and they weren't. Anything else through that?
We see today,
Go ahead.
we see today children of well-off parents that the dad was a good guy, but they took advantage, and they took advantage of the position of
Affluenza.
the business their father was in.
Yeah.
They took advantage, whether they wanted the job or not, they got it and then took advantage of it. And they're, like you've heard people say, their heart wasn't in it.
Yeah.
The Lord wasn't in it.
Yeah.
Their hearts at all. And this is something for them to take advantage of.
Yeah.
Take advantage of people given so they would take it.
Well, and part of this too could be the fact that, as we mentioned here in chapter 3, verse 1, the word of the Lord was rare in those days. There was no widespread revelation. And that kind of sets up what's going to happen with God speaking directly to Samuel. That was a very rare occurrence in these days. Maybe they had become kind of lackadaisical. Maybe they had kind of become a little bit just kind of doing their own thing, maybe not thinking much about God because God hasn't been really involved a lot maybe in the recent history, and so we're just kind of going to do our own thing. It was just something maybe since God's not going to say anything about it, we're just going to keep doing it.
In the junior high class, we've been studying the Judges, and what we noticed from it was from one generation to the next, God was left out. The children were not educated,
Mm-hmm.
and they didn't know God.
Mm-hmm.
And here we have exactly what they said. Eli knew God and served God, but it wasn't passed on to the next generation.
Right.
And so they went through that cycle.
Yeah.
That cycle of good, bad, good, bad, good, bad. And it happened to be on the next generation was the one who did not know. It's the parents' fault. And here Eli's blamed
Mm-hmm.
for not teaching his children about God.
Right.
They knew what they were supposed to do.
Right.
They had no faith.
Yeah.
God was, as Nolan said, God was not in it
Yeah.
at all.
Yeah. And to be fair, there are times where we may make, of course, no parent's perfect, but maybe let's just hypothetically, perfect parents do everything and say everything just exactly right. Does that mean 100% certain that any children are going to continue to be faithful later?
Prophet Ezekiel bears that out in his chapter. The good guy and the bad sons, and yet there may be good upon them, may be bad.
Right. Yeah. Asa, King Asa is a great example of that. Great example. Coming from really bad seeds, and then all of a sudden you have this good king, King Asa. But I mean, it boils down to they made a choice, and whether Eli was involved in that, maybe kind of didn't do as much as he should have done. I think maybe there's something to that. Obviously, God himself bears that out. He didn't restrain his sons. That's about as clear as that gets. Joe?
Just in conjunction with all that, if the secular history you brought out is true and he did become a priest, so now you've got the priest over God's people not knowing God.
Yeah. A high priest,
And I
yeah.
realize the history is later on, but when you go through the prophets, especially don't just mention Ezekiel, you see the sins of the priest being enumerated.
Yeah.
And that influence, when your spiritual leadership of the priest is such that they don't know God,
Right.
if he was a priest, if not, at least his father certainly was,
Yeah.
and he had issues, when that is reflected, when that leadership is that way, it's reflected in the people.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, Malachi, so whole chapters are dedicated to God, not just condemning his people, but condemning the priests for making a mockery of his offerings and so forth. And, when you've got that happening, it makes it really difficult for the people as well. Yeah. All right. We will stop there. We will pick up and finish Eli next week. I'll also have notes printed on Sunday for our next study in the New Testament. We're going to be talking about the centurions. The centurions. So that includes Julius the centurion, as well as Cornelius the centurion, and a couple other unnamed centurions as well. So that's what we'll look at for next notes. Thank you, everybody.